I'm Stuart Burns. I live in Western Massachusetts, but I lived here for many years, and I first met Ira in June 1968, and I've known him ever since. No one can speak for Ira, of course, but I believe that Ira would be absolutely delighted, joyous to see all of you and to be sharing all of this with you, especially in his adopted hometown of Menlo Park, where he lived for probably 60 or more years, and at the school where he taught creative writing to kids. Probably taught them some other things too, a few subversive ideas here and there. So we have a program that's going to last about an hour, we hope, and if you have the program you can see what we have in mind. And this is a celebration not only of Ira's life, but this is a celebration of life, which there is life, there is fabulous life right here. We have a mosaic of messages to offer you, and some of you will offer them as well. We have a few people who will speak in the flesh, and a few people who will have their comments read for them. We have poetry, Ira's favorite poems. We have a few words from Ira. But first, we will start with something that I know Ira would want very much to start with, very important to him, and that is 5 minutes of silence. He would probably want it to be a lot longer than that. He might want it to be the whole hour, but I remember when I first attended a workshop at the Institute in 1968, we spent a whole day of each week in silence at Point Lobos and other places. So in the spirit and memory of Ira, if we could have, if you would be willing to turn off all your electronic devices for the duration of this service, and if we could have 5 minutes of silence, and then we will proceed. Thank you very much. I'm sure some of you would probably want to continue for a while, but since we have a full program, we might as well get going. I'm sure the beautiful stage setting here speaks for itself. And I'm just going to announce the first speaker, and then I won't be announcing. People will just come up one by one because you have the program, and hopefully they'll say who they are. But please, if you come up on the stage, please use that step there so that you won't fall. So the first speaker is going to be Ira's old friend, John Markoff.
Hi, I'm John Markoff. Can everybody hear me? Yeah.
Good. In the fall of 1949, during the first weeks of my life, I met Ira SANDPERL. My parents, who were living on Stanford Avenue in College Terrace, were friends of Ira and his first wife, Merle. While I was still confined to my cradle, Ira, according to my mother, was a daily visitor. During those visits, he would speak to me, not in baby talk, but just as he would converse with an adult. As it turned out, I spoke when I was 6 months old. Ira would have been disappointed, however. Apparently, my first words were gun gun. The boys in the park outside my window were playing with toy guns. Later, my mother told me that I was speaking in complete sentences by the time I was 1. She also added that I spoke more clearly then than I would later as an adult. I credit Ira with my early verbosity. In 1950, we moved to the other side of the tracks on North California Avenue, but our families remained close. I remember tennis lessons from Ira on the courts in College Terrace, and I remember family outings, even a trip by train to the beach in Santa Cruz from the California Avenue station. As a teenager, I was a regular visitor at Kepler's, and Ira served both as a librarian without portfolio and political counselor. It was on one of those visits in 1966, as a junior at Palo Alto High School, that Ira introduced me to Robert Scheer's thin black volume, How the U.S. Got Involved in Vietnam. It armed the only 2 of us in our social studies class who opposed the war with facts. We handily won a classroom debate. I went away to college and graduate school, and I saw Ira less frequently in the 1970s. But I have a vivid memory of coming to see him in his studio apartment in downtown Palo Alto. Of course, it was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, but that's not what was striking. What I remember most clearly is that the books were 3 deep. And of course, after my visit, we had dinner at Dynashack. In 2000, I began to research a book about how the Bay Area counterculture and the anti-war movement were interwoven with the emergence of personal computing. I placed an imaginary stake in the ground at Kepler's and drew a circle that encompassed 3 computer research laboratories whose scientists and engineers were deeply influenced by the political culture that was bubbling up on the Mid-Peninsula during the mid-60s and early 1970s. From the proto-Grateful Dead who once played there in the evenings to the amorphous community who would surf the store the way we now surf the web, Kepler's was ground zero for a remarkable community during a remarkable time. Within just a few blocks, there was Doug Engelbart's Augmentation Research Group, the Whole Earth Truck Store, the Free University Store, Briar Patch Co-op, the International Foundation for Advanced Study, Peninsula School, People's Computer Company, and the Portola Institute. Ira was right in the middle of all of it, and it wasn't an accident. Today, from the distance of 4 decades, what I find most interesting is that at its core, that era reflected a set of humanist values that Ira passed on to me, as well as to everyone else who came in contact with him. In contrast, it's ironic and slightly chilling that today's Silicon Valley's unofficial religion is expressed by the notion of the singularity. Rather than augmenting humans, we've chosen to celebrate the arrival of machine intelligence. In his book, A Little Kinder, Ira once wrote that I.F. Stone's Newsweekly and the New York Times were the only required news reading. It is something that I still recall from when I first read it, and which more recently has filled me with a deep sense of responsibility. During the last decade, most of our conversations were by phone. Sometimes they were weekly and sometimes monthly. They were never brief. Ira remained the most informed person I have ever known. He retained a deep skepticism as well as a deep interest in the world I write about. I continue to try to see the world through Ira's eyes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That's beautiful. Message from Randy Keeler, Ira's old friend from as far back as 1967. This is a message from Ira's friend, Randy Keeler, who lives in Western Massachusetts and couldn't be here today. I loved Ira. Despite all his irascibleness and often erratic, rascally ways, I really loved him. I also felt that he loved me, not only during the late 1960s, when we saw a lot of each other, but right up until the time he died, as was evident from the letter he sent me just a few months ago. His love and affection meant a great deal to me. In addition to being a wonderful friend, Ira was, without a doubt, the most influential teacher I've ever had. More than anyone else, he was the one who, in the fall of 1967, first introduced me to the meaning and importance of active nonviolence, which changed my life. Among the many Ira stories I could recount, the most memorable is an incident that occurred during the fall of 1967 in the Santa Rita prison, where he and I, and probably many of you here today, were serving time as a result of a nonviolent sit-in at the Oakland Induction Center. For me, this story depicts vintage Ira. One day, we male prisoners were being marched military style from the mess hall back to our barracks by a prison guard who kept yelling at one of our number who seemed to be having trouble staying in line. Finally, the guard grabbed the fellow from behind with a hammerlock around his neck and started dragging him, bent over backwards, back into line. All of a sudden, Ira, seemingly out of nowhere, leapt onto the back of the guard, shouting, "Let go! Let go! You're hurting him!" So stunned was the guard to have this strange, skinny, middle-aged man who walked with a distinct limp clinging to his back that he instantly let go of our non-conforming brother. At which point, Ira let go of him, and the incident was over as quickly as it started. Back in our barracks, I said to Ira, "Why did you do that?" With a look that implied the answer to my question was obvious, he exclaimed, "Because he was hurting him." For me, this was an invaluable lesson in the practice of nonviolence. The lesson being, just because you're devoted to nonviolence, as Ira clearly was, it doesn't mean that you can't be a human being at the same time. A human being who responds automatically, instinctively, and sometimes even physically, to prevent violence. Thank you, Ira. I miss you. I will miss you. I think I'm next. No. Randy's next. Oh, great. Sorry. Good. That good?
Thank you. I think it's really appropriate that I follow Randy's statement because my first ever movement job was at the War Resisters League West, and Randy was going off to jail for being a draft resistor, and I'm looking at Steve Ladd and who's else here from WL West days, and also getting arrested at Santa Rita. All the women on the women's side. One of the things after we got arrested, I remember a little special charge on mine, and it said loud and tumultuous noise. That was the WRL Jug Band that performed when we were getting arrested. So I am humbled and honored to have the opportunity today to speak at Ira's celebration of life. I want to thank my good friend Laura Lee Wells, who made it possible for me to be here all the way from Durham, North Carolina. And I want to thank Molly and Scott and Steve and Martine for those who brought us all together. I've run into so many friends that I haven't seen in ages, so it's incredible to be back. Whenever I talk with others about IRA SANDPERL, these 6 words always come up. When I first met IRA SANDPERL, fill in the blank, and interestingly enough, what does it say on your name tag? I know Ira from. Basically the same thing. And then go on to share how Ira's commitment to Gandhian nonviolence philosophy and Gandhian nonviolent direct action has had an incredible impact on a whole generation of us. So I'll start with when I first met Ira's story. When I was 20 years old, at what I think was the very last session at the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence in Carmel Valley. And those who went to that session, all these years later, still stay in friendship and connection. Gail Zermano, Judy Penheiter, Bill Gonda, Paul Wesley, Sybil Marcus, Robert Ray, Rain Burns, Stuart Burns, Joan Landis, and the list goes on. Fast forward to 2011, when thanks to Martina Beebe, I had the opportunity to come from North Carolina to visit Ira and not realize that was going to be my last time seeing Ira, but we spent 4 solid hours talking, laughing, sharing pictures, showing photographs, catching up. And asking him this very simple question, because I also am in the middle of a major campaign right now, or not a campaign, but also this is the 50th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington. And a gentleman by the name of Bayard Rustin, black, gay, pacifist, I said to Ira, what do you think would be the appropriate way to really honor and celebrate him, since Joan and Ira both knew him? And he gave me about 5 different ideas to do. And now we know that the march will be happening August 24th to the 28th up in D.C. on the Mall. I'll be bringing some of those ideas from Ira. Forever not only a consummate in terms of what he believed in, but also up to date, thinking about what's going on. Before leaving, for what would be the last time I would see Ira, I got to say to his face in person the impact he had on my life as a person, but also as an activist. And that I loved him and will be forever grateful. As I close, I want to share a short piece out of Bayard's book, A Little Condor, that really, I think, underscores this consumption, the power of one, that sometimes you never know who you're going to meet in your life as your life goes on. Being a pacifist, believing in Gandhi, believing in nonviolence, and that in high school when I was a junior, someone from the American Friends Service Committee came into our class and talked about a couple of things that at the time I didn't quite understand, but years later I totally understand. He talked about the principles of nonviolence and the concept of equality and justice for all, full equality and justice for all, and the importance of this notion of the power of one, that every single one of us has the potential to impact change if we so choose to act on it. And that one class, when I was a junior all those years ago, is why I'm standing here today and why I think a lot of us are sitting here as activists who had the good fortune to run into IRA SANDPERL. So I want to just read this little piece out of this book, A Little Kinder, that I think underscores the point. I was speaking against the Vietnam War in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to an audience which was comprised by largely of Harvard undergraduates. In the question period after my speech, a man, a good deal older than the rest, asked me a series of original related questions concerning war, peace, and power politics. His questions, in fact, were so unplatitudinous stated, thank you, Ira, I facetiously said, your questions are so thoughtful, I'm going to have to think freshly about them for at least the first time in years. Who the hell are you? Very seriously, he said, I am a disciple of a disciple of yours. Ira says, I have no disciples. The gentleman says, well, there's a young man in federal prison, and he went on to say that who was there because he refused unconditionally to go into the U.S. Army. He told the presiding judge of his case that he would not allow himself to be involved in any organization that has anything to do with the deliberate taking of human life, and that includes being a killer without a gun, such as a typist or a file clerk or a medic. and because of his remarkable political and humane stand, I am strongly influenced to take a similar action. And this young man said he wouldn't be in his present situation had it not been for knowing you, Ira SANDPERL. I was going to answer the man's question and talk a little of my gentle, intelligent, and humorous friend, Randy Keeler, who was serving 3 years in prison, but the students hurriedly began asking me many questions about the draft, so I diverted from my original questioner. However, when the meeting was over, that same man and his wife approached me and asked if I could have dinner with them. I stood there and I said, sorry. They seemingly, appearingly serious, quiet, and modest. But I had to get to the airport to fly to my next speaking engagement. They asked if they could drive with me to the airport, and I happily accepted. All the way there, until I boarded the plane, that man kept on asking me what it was like for middle-class men such as ourselves to spend time in jail. I answered him as best I could, explaining that I had been in jail a number of times for nonviolent civil disobedience, but never for more than 45 days, Santa Rita. Yet I could not help wondering what was worrying this smartly dressed professor. We had exchanged names very rapidly, but I had almost forgotten his name when I was on the plane with my Bloody Mary and the notes for my next speech. Well, a few days later, I saw the man's photograph in the New York Times under a headline titled, "The Pentagon Papers." It was obvious to me that man that he met was Daniel Ellsberg. Randy Keeler's truth was stronger than all the resources of the most powerful government on earth. The power of one. Ira, we love you, and we're so grateful for you. Thank you.
I'm Martine Habib, and Joan Baez is currently traveling on tour, and she gave us a statement that I was volunteered to read. So here I go. This is from Joan. This man, Ira SANDPERL, like a pearl in the sand, he would say, was the most influential teacher and friend I've ever had. I have yet to plumb the depths of what is in my heart from the enormous loss of him. Having fallen out with each other, he would say, so many years back, we each lost a singularly precious soulmate. But never mind, it is truly all history now. When I met Ira, I was a very bored high school student, finding compulsory Quaker meeting even more boring than school. For some reason, maybe to get him out of the stodgy Sunday meetings, someone recruited Ira to teach first day school, the Quaker equivalent to Sunday school. Ira taught me basically everything I would learn to become a novice at nonviolence. For the first time in my life, the unchallenged part of my brain was set into action, and at the same time, my spirit ignited. Nonviolence became my passion, and I eventually became one of its more visible standard bearers. At 16, I would leave classes at Palo Alto High School to trudge happily down El Camino with my new friend Ira, the eccentric gentleman, bearded, wearing a three-piece suit, boiled wool hat, hobbling, arms and hands waving in the air. We would walk to an old-fashioned Palo Alto restaurant nearby, Dinah's Shack, of course. We would walk where we would eat lunch, talk nonviolence, and share nonsense and hilarity. I dragged him onto campus to go to one of my classes. The teacher was late, so Ira took the floor and began the most interesting and engaging talk the student had ever witnessed. They were riveted. The teacher walked in and let him continue, but the school made it clear that Ira should have applied for a pink slip and have been approved by the administration in order to be allowed on campus. So out we went through the front entrance and back down El Camino. We began speaking at Kiwanis clubs, Shriners clubs, churches and high schools, rich people's homes, poor people's homes. By then I was singing and speaking, And Ira was answering questions and I was storing information. We never prepared any speeches. All we had to do was observe our own principles and stay seated during the flag salute and national anthem. The uproar that inevitably followed was way beyond anything you can imagine, and we were now proud donors to dossiers at the FBI, the CIA, and NSA. Ira and I opened the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence in Carmel Valley in 1964. People still approach me to say that they went there for a weekend and it changed the course of their lives. Some say that it was the meditation, others a certain book, others a discussion. Discussions range from tactical and active nonviolence to do carrots scream, to what would you do if someone was trying to climb in your window at night? Open it, said Ira. We laughed, prayed, and marched with Martin Luther King Jr. all through the 60s, and King would send his lieutenants to the Institute to bolster their nonviolence. Strangely enough, now we can respect the grace and value of what we once shared personally and with others. What Ira wove into the pattern of my life was an undying allegiance to nonviolence. And that allegiance has brought me the most profound happiness I know. I got to say goodbye to Ira. I leaned over what I thought was his good ear and said, "Hello, Ira, it's Joni, the Antichrist." And then sang him freedom songs like "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around" and other things he knew from back in the day, back when we were unstoppable. Maybe he can take a rest from it all, then start agitating and give the Lord a run for his money. He might even convince some old lefties up there to quit polishing their halos and learn about nonviolence. Much love to all, Joan.
Women brutalizing her. Without a moment's thought, he threw himself between the two and tried to restrain the man as nonviolently as possible. The woman would have none of it. Furious. "Mind your own goddamn business," she yelled at him. Here is another story from a... Here's another story from my biography of Martin Luther King Jr., in which Ira plays a prominent role. Because, as most of you know, Dr. King visited Ira and Joan at Santa Rita Prison when they were in for 45 days for the Stop the Draft Week protest in late 1967. King looked anything but hopeful when next King and Andy Young visited Ira Sandperl, Joan's partner in crime, on the men's side of Santa Rita. The depression King had cloaked visiting his very dear friend Baez flared up full force. Sandperl, Jewish, was a peace activist and Gandhian scholar in his mid-40s who always wore Brooks Brothers suits to protests. He felt embarrassed, quote, reeking to high heaven in his smelly jail clothes, sitting with his famous friends in their polished outfits. But King's spiffy exterior belied inner bedlam. Sandperl had never before seen his friend less than fully composed. Something was wrong. "You guys, what's the matter?" he asked with his trademark chuckle. "I'm the one who should be feeling lousy. What are you upset about?" King peered around the visiting cell as if afraid he would be locked in. In fact, it was his last time behind bars. King said he really felt awful, Sandperl remembered. He was mad at himself and grief-stricken. He said that, quote, recently there were black hate groups that were both phoning him and writing him, threatening his life. "I shouldn't feel any different," he confessed. than he did about white groups that had been plotting to kill him for 11 years. I do feel differently, King said plaintively to his friend. I am really annoyed at myself. I can't believe that these black groups are people who really want my death. After all of his years of battling white racism, it had come to this: black people mattered to him more than white. But this man, Dr. King, who walked every extra mile to preserve black unity, who had fought so hard against hate, can be forgiven for being mortified by the thought that some blacks hated his guts, and for being afraid that, like Malcolm, like Gandhi, he might be slain by one of his own. A black woman had come close in 1958, slipping in a knife a hair from his heart. Struggling to maintain his equilibrium in these dark days, 3 months before he was assassinated, he could have been spared this unnecessary heartache. These threats did not come from black liberation groups. They were all fabricated by the FBI. Hoover's men were hell-bent on torturing his soul. As King left the cell, he mused, "Ira, if you're not in jail in the Poor People's March, visit me in jail, because I will certainly be there." Sandperl replied that certainly he would. These two stories, and Randy's wonderful tale, reflect certain qualities of Ira: his quixotic and impulsive nature, his courage, not being fearless, for sure, but acting in the face of fear, as his friend Martin King put it. Like Dr. King, Ira was not at all fearless, like Gandhi apparently was. Ira was never afraid, though, to speak out in favor of his precious values, to openly criticize anyone who seemed to violate his values, whether Martin King or Cesar Chavez or you or me. Ira's high-pitched laughter was magnetizing, especially when, as most often, he was laughing at himself. For me personally, Ira made me feel worthy. When, as a refugee from family crises, I landed at the Institute in Carmel Valley, a 19-year-old fresh from the East Coast, when my self-esteem had plummeted and I felt worthless deep inside, Ira lent me a sense of personal dignity and helped to instill in me a sense of mission, of purpose, that has helped me to keep going. And that dignity has energized my life mission, even as my mission has enhanced my dignity. I don't know, but this gift may be part of Ira's legacy for a lot of us here today.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a beautiful day here. I'm Dan Barth. I worked with Ira at Kepler's in 1986 and 87 when it was across the street from where it is now. And my wife and I moved on to Santa Cruz and Butte County and now Mendocino County, but Ira and I stayed in contact and corresponded and talked on the phone. I just want to read a short poem that I wrote maybe 10 years ago when I was reading about Gandhi and reading Gandhi and teaching students about Gandhi in India. And so the poem's about Gandhi, but I have to say when I read this poem now, I think of Ira as much as I do Gandhi. And it starts with an epigraph. Reporter: Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? Mr. Gandhi: I think it would be a good idea. The stuffed shirts of England choke on their roast beef at the sound of his name. The good people of India take hope at the thought of his resistance. The violent tremble in impotent rage at his pacifism. He spins the straw of empire into the gold of independence. His peace is practiced rather than preached. May his ways and days be remembered in all times and places. May the example of his courage give us strength to carry on. When you think of him, be calm. Live lives of peace and kindness in his name. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Christie, and I don't think Ira would want us to gather and tell stories about him without recalling what he was always telling us and the world. Ira was a critic, first and foremost, and that made him a challenging friend to have. He spent a lifetime telling the world off, nations and individuals. Nobody was spared his often scathing judgments, not even Sandperl. The irony that he wasn't a saint in his own life wasn't lost on him. But finding fault wasn't all that he was about. He was also warm and generous, funny and self-deprecating, and he brought an unforgettable enthusiasm, intelligence, and humor to everything he read or talked about. He influenced and inspired people all his life. I'm always going to remember my decade of conversation with the man, which ranged over books and people, history, and life, and never stopped until his last few days. Since he left us, I've been rereading that book he wrote, looking for the essence of what he had to say in his own words. I found one part that I'd like to read to you. We are deceived into believing that we can get the kind of world we seek by doing the very things we're trying to get rid of. Just a little more violence to end violence. Just a little more hatred to end hatred. Just a little more oppression to end oppression. And on and on. We're taken in because good people are doing these things. Sincere and brave people. And this is why their finer qualities, the more dangerous, this is why the finer their qualities, the more dangerous they are, the more thoroughly we are fooled. All the finest qualities in the world cannot change the simple, immutable fact that the ends cannot justify the means. But on the contrary, the means determine the ends. In all of man's history, this stands out clearly and intellectually indisputable. Yet it has been perversely, insistently, sentimentally, and tragically ignored. In this universe, the means always and everywhere, without doubt and without exception, cannot, in the very nature of things, but determine the ends. And this cannot be repeated often enough. We get what we do, not what we intend, dream, or desire. We simply get what we do. If we see and act upon this, and I will say again unabashedly what it is, the means determine the ends, then what the prophets of the ages have wistfully called utopia will become a reality. Of all that Ira impressed on me, I think this is the one principle I should never lose sight of, if our friendship meant anything. I don't think it's just about nations or war and injustice. It's also a deeper metaphor for life as it ought to be lived. We inevitably get what we do, and our lives are never all they could have been because we compromise the means. Ira was both idealist and cynic, with a huge attitude. His book was an exhortation to be a little kinder. But he wasn't always a little kinder himself. He could be very dismissive of people. But he carried a truth about with him. that he wouldn't let you forget, especially if you were friends. We should remember it.
Hi, I'm Danielle. Can you hear me okay? I'm here on behalf of Bill Shipsey. As the proud inheritor of IRA's magnificent library, I'm grateful to Molly for the opportunity to contribute to this memorial service for IRA. IRA was, in a sentence, the finest and greatest teacher I ever had, and I was privileged to have shared so many wonderful times with him and Molly in Dublin, Paris, and Palo Alto. To quote from Yeats, "Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say my glory was, I had such friends." I met Ira and Molly when Ira came to speak at my university campus in Dublin in early 1977. Ira had been invited to Ireland by the fledgling peace movement in Northern Ireland known as the Peace People, its founders, Mayread Corrigan and Betty Williams, having won the Nobel Peace Prize a few months earlier in 1976. At the time, I knew who Gandhi was, but had only a vague notion of nonviolence or the concept of waging war without violence. But I'm not going to talk about nonviolence. There are more worthy activists gathered here to speak today. I want to talk instead of Ira's great love for literature and of his message that great literature, like all great art, helped us to better understand and to make sense of our world. Like many of you here, I spent innumerable evenings enraptured, listening to Ira's wonderful stories and literary anecdotes, whether it was about his hero Aldous Huxley's encyclopedic knowledge and exhortation for all of us to be a little kinder, Tolstoy's unrivaled literary powers, the sibling rivalry between William and Henry James, or the touching story of Thomas Mann's request to the openly gay W.H. Auden to marry his daughter as a means of escape from Nazi Germany. These stories were the currency of Ira's life. He gave away these riches for free to all of us who knew and loved him. I am reminded also of the story he told about how you could not take the life of someone like Gandhi, who literally gave away his life all the time. And so did Ira. He was generous to a fault, but he was no god. He was wonderfully, delightfully, and mischievously human. There was great fluidity and drama to his storytelling, his expressive hands, his sparkling eyes, his distinctive laugh, his beautiful prose. He had a way of drawing his audience in. You felt as if you were seated before Socrates. And like Socrates, he took delight in the opportunity presented to corrupt the minds of the young, with his lessons on Gandhi, Tolstoy, Camus, or Huxley. Whilst nonviolence was his abiding conviction in life's work, his true love, apart from Molly, was literature and poetry. We all know how he loved to read books, but he also loved to share them. And there is unlikely to be many at this memorial service who were not the recipient of Ira's book-giving largesse or helpful book-buying suggestions. Now that he is no longer with us in person, the story of how I came to acquire his library can be told. 15 years ago, I proposed to Molly that as a means of helping to support Ira financially, I would buy his library, but he would remain the owner for his lifetime. He could continue to add to it or take from it as he pleased. At Molly's request, Ira was not to know who had acquired the library. I sometimes wondered if he had his suspicions about the purchaser, especially when I visited him in Menlo Park several years ago, feigning lack of interest in the books. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I boast that this was one of the shrewdest investments I ever made, the ascent of Kindle notwithstanding. Because although I know that Ira continued to give away books, technically mine, the rate at which he replenished the stock and acquired new books meant that when he passed away in April, there were many more books than when I bought the library in 1998. Almost 5,000 titles crammed into his Menlo Park studio apartment, covering every inch on every wall in every room. As many of you may also know, at the suggestion of Molly and Armand, our next speaker, the contents of the library have been cataloged, mostly to let those who knew him see what exactly there was and to share the breadth of his literary interests. I want to thank Molly, Gabe Ladd, Hillary Hart, Martine Habib, and me, who joined my son Matthew in the 2-day cataloging labor of love. Ira's library is presently in 133 boxes on a container ship somewhere in the North Atlantic, en route to their new home in Dublin. But despite the dilution with my own modest collection, it will always be the IRA SANDPERL library. I would also wish to be able to say that I intend to retire to my castle tower to read them all. But alas, I must continue to ply my trade as a barrister and try in my very small way, through my various human rights-related involvements, to contribute to making the world a slightly less bad place, as Ira would have put it. There is not a day when I do not think of him. His stories have become my stories. His aspirations and example have become my ambition. He has influenced my worldview more than any other person. Meeting him and Molly was the seminal happening in my life. To his oft-quoted saying, "Gandhi the rat, you ruined my life," I can in all honesty say, "Ira, you rascal, who occasionally longed to be a saint, you shaped mine." Thank you.
Hi, Scott. It's at least 30 years since I met you, or saw you last, Scott. Thanks for all those lessons in calculus. It didn't do me any good. I am delighted to be here. Thank you, Molly, for asking me to come by and give some thoughts that I have about IRA. So I am humbled by being here. I certainly am no Joan Baez, and I guess much to my chagrin, I don't own IRA's library. I'm here just as a friend, and I believe that we are all here together as a group who have been touched by Ira's life and mind. So to me, our gathering today is a celebration of Ira's life. I met Ira when I was 16 years old and a sophomore at Woodside High School. We were emigres from Iran, and each of us, as kids, needed a little bit extra money to pay for our after-school activities. I loved books then, so I applied for a job at Kepler's. The first day I showed up at work, I met Ira, and that evening Molly came over to give him a ride, so we've known each other since that first day. I was captivated by Ira. He had enormous knowledge. My love of books took on a different dimension and a different tangent due to his encouragement. And his love of books and knowledge is something that kept me glued to Ira for the last 33 years. Walter Kaufmann's biography of Nietzsche, Holkut's A German Love Story, Hermann Broch's Death of Virgil, Elias Canetti's Crowds and Power, and the list went on. Freud's Mourning and Melancholy, which I think we should all read, especially given the event. He had an enormous love for art and music. One day he told me there was nothing in the world of art like 1920s France. So I went and learned about 1920s France in the world of art. John Richardson's biography of Picasso, Kenneth Clark's essays on art. He knew it all. Then there was music. He loved Pablo Casals and the cello. Then there was politics, nonviolence, and Gandhi, as we all know. He knew political philosophy like no one else. He had read them all. Hannah Arendt's political philosophy, Simone Weil's activism, Nadezhda Mandelstam's writings. There was nothing he didn't know. And those three were some of his female heroes. And he always told me that even though I shouldn't repeat it, he didn't believe in pacifism, but he believed in nonviolence as a political force. And that, I think, is as true today as it's ever been, and probably as needed today as it's ever been. Through IRA, I met Peter Zago, and I don't know if Peter's here. Hello, Peter. And had the wonderful occasion to join them on their Sunday lunches. The discussions of politics were abound, both local and national and international. He introduced me to Régis Debray, who was a political philosopher and the foreign affairs advisors to Mitterrand's government. Once I was visiting Paris as a student, and Ari gave me the home phone number for Régis. He was a very celebrated man at the time, in the mid-'80s and early '90s. I called Régis and I introduced myself. He knew exactly what I was going to ask him, and he gently said he didn't have any time to meet me that evening since he was on his way to an international diplomatic mission. He then paused, waited for another couple of seconds, and then said, "Well, why don't you come by anyway tonight for a little bit? I would like to see you, and I will do anything for IRA." Everyone that knew IRA would drop everything for him and would do anything for him. Through IRA, I met the most important constitutional lawyer in the United States of our times, Leonard Boudin, Needless to say, after the introduction, I got a summer clerkship with him. He then introduced me to one of the most important art lawyers in Washington, D.C., and yes, again, I got the clerkship. In short, there was nothing that people wouldn't do for Ira, and that was because of the generosity of his spirit. Ira loved Paris. He lived there for many years, and he loved fine everything. When he ate, he loved to eat great food. When he drank, he loved to drink gorgeous wines. And he loved beautiful women, Molly among them, who was the love of his life, and Inès de la Fressange, the Chanel model. To exemplify how Ira loved fine things, there was a sit-in over death penalty many years ago in the East Bay. Ira and a group of activists participated in the sit-in to block the traffic to one of the jails where the death penalty was being considered. Needless to say, they were all put in jail for a day or two. I got a call from Vacaville prison to go and get Ira out, so I did. After I got him out of jail, I asked him, where should we go to grab a bite to eat? He said, how about the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley? He then continued, this is really a true story. I didn't make this up from Dublin. He repeated, I love those brunches, and they make the best gin fizz. And then he continued, I love to watch tennis. The tennis courts right below me, there's some pretty good tennis players in that club. The anecdotes could go on and on, much about his importance in all of our lives, about nonviolence and about other things, but much as a friend. In one of her essays, Simone Weil writes, there is a reality outside the world. I'm going to repeat this. There is a reality outside the world. That is to say, outside space and time, outside man's mental universe, outside any sphere whatsoever that is accessible to human faculties. And to me, if I were to have a reality outside the world, space and time, it would be the life that Ira led. Without being a saint, he was true. He was true to his beliefs, he was true to his world, and he was true to his time. In parting, I would like to repeat a line from W.H. Auden, one of Ira's favorite poets. I will love you, dear, till China and Africa meet, and the rivers jump over the mountains, and the salmon sing in the street. Thank you.
Campus Resistance. And tonight we're going to have three speakers. First will be Isaac Sandperl, who's director of the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence. Then will be Joan Baez Harris. And finally, David Harris. Ira?
Thank you, Jeff. A few months back, David and Joan and I went around the country talking about the necessity to resist militarism, violence in all its forms. Sometimes I felt that part of this Trinity is the Father, but mostly the Holy Ghost. That's all I feel tonight. But I think more than ever, what you and I have to do is really break out of the archaic nation state. That's what sends young men who don't want to kill in Vietnam. It sends young Russians into Czechoslovakia. It sends young Nigerians into Biafra, and so on and so on. You can make your own, gruesome list. It also keeps people hungry and oppressed. It keeps minority groups really squashed. The military does this everywhere. And it's this kind of change that we are asking that you make with your lives and we make with ours. And this is the revolution. And that revolution, to really be meaningful, must be a message of truth, and it must be a message of love. Thank you.
wanted this program to go for about an hour, and so it's gone for about an hour. But we did want to have just a few minutes. If any of you are, if the Spirit moves you to make a very short, maybe up to 2-minute comment about IRA, and come on up here and introduce yourself. And I'm actually going to, because we really do want to get to the reception, I'm going to sit in the front row. And if you go over 10 minutes, if you go over 2 minutes, I'm going to just raise my hand. But please feel free to come up if you have something you'd like to offer.
Hi, my name's Sharon Hendricks, and I carried this paper up only because I didn't prepare anything so that my hands would have something to do. I met Ira in 2005 at Cafe Baroni's. At the time, I was sort of between parts of my life, and so I spent a lot of time at Cafe Baroni's. I tell people now that I had meals there, probably 17 meals a week or something. And Ira was always there in the mornings, and so at some point I said hello to him, and we started nodding to each other, and one day I sat down and had breakfast with him, and I had figured him for a retired Stanford professor, and after an hour and a half of listening to him talk, I said, "So what did you do?" And he said, "My dear, I have 3 passions: books, nonviolence, and beautiful women." And a few weeks or months later, after the holidays, I think in early 2006, and they hadn't been particularly good holidays. I'd been here, not with my family, and it had been sort of quiet, and so it was January and gray, and a friend of mine and I were talking about the fact that she'd also had a gray and sort of dismal holiday. And one of the stories that Ira had said was that his greatest regret was that he'd never see Paris again. And so I guess on the theory that the best way to get yourself out of a funk is to do something nice for someone else, I said to my friend Jennifer, "Let's take Ira to Paris." And so we did. We didn't know what to expect. It was very spur of the moment. We put it together in about a week's time. We went to his apartment and said, "I have something I want to talk to you about." Went to his apartment and proposed it, and he said it was not what he was expecting. I don't remember what he thought I was going to propose, but he said he'd have to talk it over with Molly. And he called me a few hours later and said, "This is what Molly has always feared. I've lost my mind." And this is proof that I've lost my mind. So he talked about Paris, and he talked about his friends there, and it turned out it was Martin Luther King weekend, and we left on Thursday, got there on Friday. He talked about his friend Inez and his friend Christophe, and we figured that they were both about Ira's age. And we had a very nice dinner at a very nice French restaurant, and Christophe turned out to be 59 and looked 10 years younger and was very debonair, and we got to listen to the song about Luba, and the night Joan met Christophe when he was, I think, 17. And Inez was not 75, and she was 47 and looked 10 years younger. And it was a magical weekend. 80 hours later, we were back in Palo Alto and didn't know what had happened to us. So we decided to do something for him, and what we got back was very, surprise and unexpected and just wonderful. We met some amazing people. And I'm probably over my 2 minutes, sorry. But I'll just say that the line I always think of from Ira was when I would say, "So how are you? How are you?" He would say, "Undeservedly well, my dear." Thank you.
I remember that line from. My name is Steve Ladd, and I was fortunate to be at that event at UC Berkeley where Ira spoke in 1968. That was my introduction to Ira. And I think probably everybody here has an Ira story to tell. And Ira had an impact on many of us, all of us presumably, and on so many people throughout the world, really. I think Ira is kind of a unique person in that respect. I think it's rare that that kind of person comes along in your life that has that kind of impact, that makes you think differently, that really changes your life. And Ira had that impact on so many people. On me, I was in my freshman year at UC Berkeley. I had filed for a conscientious objector status in 1968. I was 18. Ira spoke Joan spoke and David spoke. We were there, of course, to meet and hear from Joan, but Ira and David had more impact on us, to be honest, than Joan did. It made us think, made me think, well, what should I do? Should I be a CO or should I be a draft resistor? And Ira's words and David's words really challenged us at the time to think about draft resistance. So we did. We organized a group on the Berkeley campus called the Berkeley Peace Brigade, and we ended up collecting over the next couple of years about 5,000 draft cards. I turned mine in, and 5,000 others on the Berkeley campus through our work turned in their draft cards. Up through May of 1970, when, as many of you may remember, the invasion of Cambodia occurred, and then there were the killings at Kent State, which really caused a huge outpouring of sentiment. And one of the other connections Ira and I had was that we were invited by students at Kent State to go to Kent State in the fall of 1970 to bring the message of nonviolence, along with Ralph Abernathy and others. So Ira and Ralph were there to speak to the group, to speak to these crowds and preach the message of nonviolence as a new way to start the new year. And we also conducted workshops and so forth, and it was a great moment. And I'll share with you, if you like, a picture of Ira and I. My hair was a little different then. It was just a little bit longer, as many of us, I'm sure, were at the time with our hair. But it was an important moment for me and for many people, that connection with Ira. And it continued over the years. I went to the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence, as many people did, in the Los Altos Hills at the time. And later in life, my son Gabe, who was mentioned as helping to pull together Ira's library to catalog it, to get it over to Bill Shipsey. Gabe and Ira connected. We came and I introduced Ira and Gabe at one point. And Gabe, not because of me, has a love of great books that he shared with Ira. And so they developed a really nice friendship over those books, over those authors and connections that I think ended up meant a lot to Ira. And it meant a lot to Gabe, too, who heard, as a result, as was mentioned, long phone calls, lots of stories, things that he otherwise would not have heard about, connections with Martin Luther King and stories, that who else would tell those stories, to you? So that connection also, I think, has been really meaningful to our family and has taught another generation of young people the importance of literature, the importance of Martin Luther King's work, the importance of nonviolence. And I'll close just by saying one other thing, which is I think many of us remember that Ira would often say, well, we're going to change all that, And it was later, when we would talk, that he would sort of wonder, well, he'd say, we haven't really changed all that, have we? And we haven't. No, of course not, Ira. But I think the one thing that we can do and take from all of this is perhaps to continue to try to change all of that, to take Ira's message of love and nonviolence and carry that with us as much as possible. And I know I try to do that, and I hope we all will eventually change all of that. Thank you.
I'm Carl Schonborn, and this is a kind of Ira, you rat, you ruined my life kind of story, or tribute. I knew Ira from my English classes at Pali in 1959, and from Quaker retreats in Marin and Tahoe that Ira and Roy Kepler conducted, and from the Institute in Carmel. I went back east for 4 years to college, and then started medical school. And during my first year in med school, shots rang out across the street at the Audubon Ballroom, and Malcolm X was shot and was rushed over to the med school where I was to be treated, and he didn't make it. That event at the end of, or in my first year in med school, and the fact that violence was tearing up America as well as Vietnam, and crime was skyrocketing and all of that in America, caused me to reassess my plans to be a doctor. And so I left medical school and decided to apply to graduate school to study war and conflict resolution and nonviolence. I first, though, had to go through the Whitehall Draft Board, which was in Lower Manhattan. And this is the draft board that Arlo Guthrie made famous in Alice's Restaurant. I thought, well, I was taught by the best. My CO papers are in good order. This is a slam dunk. I'll get my CO papers, CO classification. Well, the examining doctor looked at me and said, I'm not giving out any stinking COs. You're going to get a 4F, because I know you had a cleft palate and a cleft lip. So I eventually went on, got a PhD instead of an MD, went and had a career researching and teaching about violence and nonviolence. And the rat IRA, I've pretty much gotten paychecks that orderlies get and not that doctors get. But I love IRA for ruining my life.
I don't know. I'm Lee Swenson. I don't know how you all don't cry, but anyway. I had a real meaningful time this last week thinking about Ira, who I met here in 1959 and began coming to Peninsula School, wound up teaching here for some years after that, and left to go to East Palo Alto when Ira and Joan took the institute down, began the institute in Palo Alto. But I think one of the things I wrote about was the enormous gift that Ira did to keep us, I was a philosophy major at Stanford and wasn't reading the stuff that I should be reading. So I dropped out of Stanford and became a draft resistor. And I thought the great gift that Ira had was the intellectual power and thought that he had to bring all this wonderful literature to us. And also, John and I were just hearing Ira again, is the way he spoke, I think, infused the resistance, draft resistance, with a really great, powerful, I mean, that was what, a minute and a half or 2 minutes? Yeah. I mean, that's enough to change everything. So, I mean, that was a great gift, and I think that was really one of the, besides, making us lifelong readers and thinkers and feelers, was to really give us a way to speak. So, thank you, Ira.
Brielle Jonk, and I live here in Menlo Park. I was inspired by the wonderful woman who took Ira to Paris. And so, although Ira was important and Ira was a literary man, I just want to give you another side to Ira as Ira the rascal, troublemaking man. I went to the study for nonviolence in 1970, and it was a gift from my husband to me. And I had 3 small children, the youngest being 6 months, and the oldest being 4. So this was quite a holiday for me to go to do this. And I didn't really know I knew about Ira and I knew about Joan, but there were celebrities. I really didn't know who they were. And I got there, and Ira just captured my heart. And he kept saying to me, tell me more about your life, tell me more about your husband, tell me more about you. And he's, as you all know, he's quite a romantic. And it didn't take long, but Ira started to call my home, much to the chagrin of my husband. And the calls would come at 7 and 10 and 12 and 2 in the morning. And he would say, My darling, your husband's an idiot. An idiot. You have to leave him. You have to leave him. So we were organizers for Cesar Chavez down in Salinas when I was living there. And then we ended up here at Peninsula School where my husband was a teacher. And Ira continued to call. And before long, I'm at Ricky's Hyatt house at 11 in the morning drinking Black Russians with Ira SANDPERL. And if anybody knows about Ira and his Black Russians, and there we were, and you know, Ricky's, that old place with those blue blinds so the sun would never come in, and it was dark, and it was leather, and I dropped the children off to school, and my husband was here, and the two of us would go down there in this old Volkswagen bus we had, and we would drink until, oh my God, it was 2:45, and we had to get back here and pick up the kids, and we'd drive around that circle, and Ira would get out, and everybody would know Ira, and he'd have his hat and his three-piece suit and everything, and he'd be 3 sheets to the wind, and we'd gather the children together, and one day he said to me, we should go to Mexico. We should live in Mexico. That would be wonderful. He said, I have a trust fund. I think it's about $140 a month. And I thought, I'm in trouble in my marriage, but this I don't need. You know, I can't, I'm not going to go, you know, from the frying pan into the... So we went along like this, and you know, cheek to jowl, and pretty soon I left my husband. Ira met Molly. Our lives went on, and I never stopped loving him. And he took me away from something else, and it was a wonderful time, and goodbye, dear friend, goodbye. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, and Molly won his heart, and here we are all together, and I brought some sweet peas for Molly today.
And a freshman at Stanford, and my friend Jeffrey Shirtliff, who's sitting in the audience there, will remember this well. But Ira and Joan would come by our freshman dorm and hang out, basically. And in the lounge, Ira would carry on, and he had this way of speaking, which was really hypnotic. And you know, the hours would wear on, and some of the students who actually had to study would go off to their rooms and do that. But Jeffrey and I continued to hang out and listen to this guy, this crazy guy, Ira, talk about ends and means and nonviolence. And he was truly a magician in that sense, that I liken him to, as it's been said, Socrates or Diogenes, some crazy, funny philosopher who could capture your heart and capture your mind. Well, in the end, Ira drove a wedge between myself and my past, myself and my middle-class upbringing, and myself and my father, who had served in World War II, like many of our parents. And so I became first a conscientious objector and then a draft resistor. Those were hard years. I think that I was at odds with my family for at least 10 years and finally got it back together. But, you know, eventually my father, who couldn't really understand what I was doing and why I was doing it, said that he respected me for what I was doing at that time. So, but Ira was so unique. I think as much as Gandhi would say, a satyagrahi, which was a warrior for truth, as much as he was taking his stand for nonviolence, he was saying to all of us, you must be the change that you would see. You know, it's about ends and means, and it's about living your life in a certain way. He had this great truth about him, which was infectious. And I know it infected me, and I like to think that my life is the better for all of that. And I know that he's impacted many of you in the same way. I was one of those in jail with him in 1967. in Santa Rita. And I do remember meeting Martin Luther King when we got out about 10 weeks before Martin was killed. So a lot of memories come back thinking about IRA and those years, but we carry on, and I think the things that IRA taught us then are still true today. So I salute you, IRA, and we love you, and I salute the rest of you.
Well, this has all been incredibly moving, especially these final beautiful statements by people. I'd like to thank and express gratitude to the small group of people stretching from Dublin to Palo Alto, Menlo Park, San Francisco, who pulled this all together and just, did this amazing gathering for us today. And on their behalf, I would like to thank you all for coming and being part of this and sharing, and hope that you will all stay for the reception, because the reception might be as much fun as this has been, maybe even more fun. So we hope you will stay for the reception, and thank you all so much for coming. It's been really, really great to see all of you here.